Good morning. I hope that your Wednesday is off to a good start. Mine is so far. Carolina mug, made of course by my favorite potter. Man, I can use a lot of this weather. This is great. Last week, if you remember, I talked for a few minutes about the books that might be called the Apocrypha or Old Testament pseudepigrapha, and those terms are they're different. An apocryphal book, the Old Testament Apocrypha, they're historical books, meaning that they generally deal with matters of Jewish history and can actually be quite useful to read, but they're not in the canon and never really have been considered canonical. And then there's a totally separate group of writings called the pseudepigrapha. These are writings that are falsely attributed to historical figures, particularly Moses, Enoch, Elijah, any number of Solomon, any number of other famous historical figures from the Old Testament, and they're falsely attributed. Pseudepigrapha means false writing. The pseudepigrapha generally was, if you remember from last week, are very apocalyptic, end of the world type stuff. And I want to do the same for the New Testament today. So, we did Old Testament last week, New Testament this week. So we have our New Testament books. We have our Bibles, 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. And by the way, this is the best kind of Bible, not because of the translation, but simply because it's beat up. The best kind of Bible is one that's beat up. That means it's been used a lot. So we have our canon, our accepted list, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament. This canon of 66 books didn't come down with Moses from Mount Sinai. It gradually developed over time. By inclusion rather than by exclusion. Earliest canon lists were pretty small, so I think in New Testament now, from the earliest days, by the very early part of the 2nd century, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were being circulated together. And of course, prior to them, in terms of date of writing, were Paul's letters. And so the very earliest canon lists from the 2nd century, meaning the 100s AD, the 4 Gospels plus a handful of Paul's letters. And then that list gradually grew over time. Some books were relatively late getting sort of broadly accepted as being canonical. Hebrews was relatively late, and that's because really no one knew who wrote it. It was widely accepted by the church, it was used widely, but by golly, no one in the world knows who wrote this thing. And that's the way it is for Hebrews now. The author is totally anonymous. Revelation. And we can link it back to the Apostle John, but wow, this is some weird stuff. And the Epistle of James. A couple of question marks. Did James, the half-brother of Jesus, actually write it? And also, some people say that James sort of runs counter to Paul's teachings. I don't really think it does, by the way. And over the years, as canon lists were published and by various people. Sometimes major Christian writers, other times by people who are at best marginally Christian. The canon grew. An odd thing about the canon is that the canon sort of comes from the church. It comes from tradition, if you will. So we as good Protestant Christians say that you value Scripture over tradition. But in a way, the canon comes from church tradition. The canon emerged out of usage by the church. The canon emerged out of usage by the church. And there were sort of 4 different criteria that the early church seems to have used in determining what they would view as being canonical or authoritative. One, was it written by an apostle? Was it written by an apostle? Can it be linked to an apostle? So you have the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John, they are both members of the original 12. Luke was a companion of Paul in his missionary journeys. Mark sort of flamed out as a companion of Paul, but in his favor, Mark was a known associate of Peter, and there's a strong tradition that Peter influenced the writing of Mark's gospel. Is it widely used by the whole church? Is it widely used by the whole church? If a book is written by an apostle, if there's a strong tradition that leaks it back to John or Matthew or Paul or whomever else, and is it being used by the whole church? Is it being used by the whole church broadly? Does it sort of fit in with what we already know? So we have, like particularly the Gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You've got another writing, and there's a strong tradition that takes it back to an apostle. It's used broadly by the whole church, and yet it's sort of the teaching of this, the content of it matches what we already know and accept. That's a big plus. But if it runs counter in important ways to what we already have, then that's a big strike against it. And then the last one is it inspired by the Holy Spirit? And that, of course, is going to be something that is, you can only have to recognize it. When you recognize it, you know it when you see it. It's like I cannot remember the name of the Supreme Court justice, was famous for one time saying, he's asked like what pornography was, and he said he couldn't give a definition, but he knew it when he saw it. So perhaps that's a way we can look at inspiration. It's not a hard, fast, like this is flashing red light, meaning no, 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 and this is flashing blue light, yes, inspired, but you know it when you see it. So there are 2 or 3 different kinds of writings that are written either in the New Testament era itself in the 1st century, or written in the next couple of centuries after that. So let's look at them. So first, there are some writings that come from the 1st century itself, or from early 2nd century, meaning the 100s, that were clearly useful and prized in the early church, but were never considered canonical. For example, the Shepherd of Hermas, the first epistle of Clement, the Didache, they're Christian writings from the late 1st century or early mid-2nd century, and the early church valued them and considered them to be useful, but for one reason or another were never really considered canonical. They failed one of those tests above. And then there are other writings which New Testament Apocrypha, New Testament Pseudepigrapha. And these are related terms. And these are books that were not included in the New Testament canon because they, primarily because they reflect teachings that run counter to what they already had. Because they were Gnostic, and Gnosticism was the main heresy that the church was combating in the 2nd century. It's one of several significant heresies the church dealt with in its first 300 years or so. So we have this body here which reflect teachings that don't mesh with what we already know. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know they're written in the 1st century, and you have a gospel over here that was written 100 years later and is falsely, everybody knows, was falsely claimed to have been written by a significant person. And this book over here also runs counter to these 4 here that we know are sound. And so this book over here doesn't get grouped in. So the New Testament Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Apocrypha is probably not, in my opinion, a good term to use, because the Apocryphal books in the New Testament era or after are really different from the Old Testament Apocrypha. Old Testament Apocrypha, they're primarily historical. They're historical, so if you want to learn something about history of the Jewish people in the intertestamental period, they can be very useful. And the New Testament Apocrypha isn't that. They're not historical. Probably better to just consider them pseudepigrapha, because they are books like Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Apocalypse of Peter, books that came along 100 years after the New Testament era, or even more, clearly not written by the person whose name is on the title, and they, in one or more ways, run really counter to what we already know is authoritative. These books they can be helpful, they can be useful from a historic standpoint, in that if you want to know what the early Gnostics believed, or what fringe Christian groups believed here or there, they can be useful. But from a religious standpoint, they probably aren't so useful, because in their teachings, they run counter to what we already know. They run counter to what is accepted. So the New Testament canon, just to go back to that, it grew by inclusion, and this is a really important point to make, and it's a misconception. We have this idea, and popular culture fosters it, that we started off with a whole bunch of books that everybody used, and at some point along the way, there were groups of people that gathered and okay, we're gonna strike this book out and strike this book out and strike this book out, and so you start off with this big canon and you're gonna whittle it down. One of the most common misnomers or misconceptions is that that's what the Council of Nicaea did. The canon grew by inclusion. It started off quite small and then got progressively bigger. It didn't start big and get small. It started quite small. I think if I remember correctly, the earliest canon list from the late 2nd century had maybe 13, 12 or 13 books in it. And it gradually grew into the 27 that we have now. The canon grew by inclusion, by adding more and more books into it. And in case you're wondering, the canon has been considered closed by church tradition since St. Athanasius' Festal Letter in 376 AD. So with that, most important thing, we have our canon. Read it. That is the most important thing. And the best Bible of all isn't what flavor of study Bible it is or what translation is. This is an ESV, but that doesn't matter so much if it's an NIV or a King James or a New Revised Standard. The most important thing is that it's old and beat up because it gets used so much. With that, I hope you have a great rest of your day.